From the nation's capital for National Public Radio, this is Charlie Cobb speaking to you from the Eisenhower Theater of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. In a moment, another program in the continuing series of National Town Meetings. The topic of this National Town Meeting, human behavior, is it really getting worse? The principal speakers will be Dr. B.F. Skinner, author and psychologist, and Dr. Rollo May, author and psychologist. Following the initial presentations, members of the audience will have the opportunity to present questions to the speakers. These National Town Meetings are aimed at presenting distinguished figures from various walks of life, discussing with you, our radio audience, and with the audience assembled here at the Kennedy Center, some of the most vital topics of the day. And now, the moderator of this National Town Meeting, Tom Zito of the Washington Post.
Many of us have read stories and seen on television a great deal of questioning in recent years about human behavior. Many are criticizing the courts for becoming too liberal at turning out allegedly convicted criminals. Jesse Jackson has suggested that perhaps it would be much better for black parents not to teach their children that they have been victimized, because this will inevitably stunt their future development. Last year, Midge Decter wrote a book called Liberal Parents, Radical Children, in which he suggested that because the younger generation of children had been brought up in such a liberal and permissive environment, that they now thought that they didn't really have to grow up, and anything that they wanted would be theirs. Today we have with us two psychologists who have done a lot of thinking and writing on the subject. Dr. Rollo May, best known perhaps as an author, but a man who has also practiced extensively as a psychotherapist, now resides in Marin County, California, and is probably best known for his award-winning book, Love and Will. Professor B.F. Skinner of Harvard University, probably the man best linked with behavioral psychology and an approach to psychology in which one examines not so much the mental approach that a person takes to his behavior, but rather the external conditions that come to control his behavior. I'm told that I have an opportunity to ask the first question to open the show, so I would like to ask both Dr. May and Dr. Skinner, is there a conflict in trying to understand human behavior in terms of free will and determination versus conditions that come to control human behavior, operant conditioners? Dr. Skinner, if you would begin.
Well, I first heard this question almost 50 years ago when I took a course with George Sarton, a very distinguished historian of science. And his answer was that human behavior is getting better, and he gave as evidence a description of the torture of a poor devil who had been caught and accused of trying to assassinate one of the kings of France. He'd been put on a platform in the middle of a large square in Paris where he was systematically tortured. His hands were burned and plunged into bowls of burning sulfur, and finally he was pulled apart by 4 horses. Now, on the balcony, the royal family watched with their children. The spaces in the windows fetched a very high price. The square was, of course, full, and there was a great deal of sexual activity apparent. And he described this, and he said, "Gentlemen, we are getting better." But 2 years later, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. So human behavior does get better, and it gets worse, back and forth, but I think not because there's any change in people. That would mean some kind of genetic change, and those things take place very slowly. We do not in our own lifetime see any change in human nature. if you mean by that what the human species is like. In fact, I don't suppose there's been much of a change in recorded history. But we do see changes in the social environment, or what we call a culture. And those changes bring about vast differences in human behavior. Now, from the point of view of the individual, we are at the moment now where things are better. The individual is having a high time. But from the point of view of society and others, we are quite clearly at a stage where things are worse. And that, I think, is because the culture no longer maintains the sanctions, the environmental conditions, which lead people to behave well with respect to others.
Well, if I address myself to the question, which we were asked to do for the first 2 minutes, is human behavior getting worse? I have to say it's an unanswerable question. If human behavior is getting worse, it also is getting better. But there are certainly signs of it's getting worse. And these are in the great numbers of war these days. There have been more wars in the first 3/4 of the 20th century than in the whole 700 years before that. Concentration camps are now a recognized method of warfare and conflict, and this, initiated in Germany, was a relatively new and a terribly cruel thing. Milgram's Eichmann experiments, in which he showed that people would do not only things that cause pain to others, but even cause the death of somebody else if they were told to. Now, we do have a real question, even though it cannot be answered. And the techniques, you see, the tools, the technology for evil is much more effective than it used to be. Witness this hijacking of airplanes. Now, I think the real problem goes below the question of human behavior, and is that we are living in a transitional age, a radically transitional age, such as the age at the fall of the Greek period, the age at the end of the Roman period, the age at the end of the Middle Ages, and always this transitional age when one society is transmuted into another. This period is a period of tremendous unrest. The standards and values change. Our marriage and sexual customs have certainly radically changed. Religious standards have radically changed in the past 30 or 40 years. The old mooring places are no longer there. And that is why we are all cast loose, so to speak. We have nothing to tie our boats to. We have to find our own morality and our new social morality. Now, this means that we're in a period of tremendous change. And this change certainly is a reason for despair on one side. But I think it's even more a reason for a sense of opportunity. You and I can have a part in the building of a new society, quotes new, at least partially new society, that I think can be a new kind of renaissance.
Dr. Skinner?
May I comment on that? I like the example of the hijackings particularly because it makes very conspicuous the kind of social control that I'm talking about. It is undoubtedly the case that the hijacking of planes, the risking of hundreds of lives and so on, is an outstanding example of what we would call bad behavior with respect to people in general. In America, we have taken the trouble to institute search at airports and have enormously cut down on this. Now, the point that I want to make is that many people resent that. They do not feel there's anyone that has any right to search them as they board a plane. And there have been challenges to the legality of the whole system. But searching people who go onto a plane is an example of the kind of social control which has made it safer for people to fly in planes and has reduced a lot of the behavior that we call bad or evil. And I think it happens to be a very clear-cut example. If I were able, I would give you as clear an account of all of the sanctions which we fail to maintain in our daily life, which are permitting violence in the streets all kinds of ill-mannered behavior with respect to each other and so on. It's harder to pinpoint that than it is to pinpoint searching baggage at an airport, but it's the same kind of thing. If we want people to behave well, if we want them to stop behaving badly, then we must impose some kind of social sanctions. It's a question of what society does with respect to the individual, and the individual will resist on the grounds that he has the right, but society must insist that it is, after all, the rights of society to control the individual when the potentiality for evil behavior exists.
We have our first speaker. Can I ask you, when you step to the microphones, to please give your name, where you're from, and to whom you're addressing the question. Please keep the question under a minute.
My name is Bob Curry. To either Dr. May or Dr. Skinner, what's the role of individual responsibility and creativity in this change that you've both just described?
Okay, yes. Well, this is where Fred Skinner and I have had many discussions up till now. I think the role of responsibility and creativity is very great. I think that this is a period when we have no mooring places, which means we have to cast loose. We have to figure out something new. We have to look for new morals, new standards. And this is a creative act. Let us call it ethically creative. Now, I think also responsibility. This is a word that plays a large part in my own thinking. Responsibility is also part and parcel of this transitional age, in that each of us is part of this age. You see, the age changes, but you and I are this age. And we, therefore, far from being a cop-out, this historical analysis that I've just briefly hinted at, far from being a cop-out, I think it really is a challenge to each of us to assume a responsibility, at least as best we can assume it, in which we will accept our part in, if I may use a grandiloquent phrase, in the forming of a new renaissance.
May I comment on that, since I'm on the point of agreeing with Dr. May, one of those rare occasions? I feel, too, that creativity is a matter of selection, and that what we need to do is to look for new ways of behaving so that people will indeed behave better. This has gone on through the evolution of the species. Darwin was dealing with creativity and the origin of species, and is going on in the evolution of cultures. We are working out, slowly and erratically, ways of inducing people to behave well with respect to each other, and to do the kinds of production, the kinds of inventive work which will make this species more likely to solve its problems and survive. Rather than say there's something in the individual called creativity that does this, I would want to look at the actual cultural practices and note that some of those bring out behavior which works for the survival of the culture, others do not, and as in the evolution of species, we are evolving a culture which will presumably create better conditions for good behavior.
Are you waiting to ask a question? Okay, next questioner over here, please.
My name is Walter B. Smalley, popularly known as Snoopy Jr., son of Mr. Schultz' famous rascal, which appears in your paper, Mr. Zito. And I'll better hurry on with my statement in question. This writer predicted the ultimate falling out of the totalitarian societies of Russia and China way back in 1955 in a published article. Since then, other communist groups have followed the lead of Tito in opposing Russia. My question, aren't fascist and communist societies fundamentally alike in their authoritarian approach, and therefore also alike in repressing the best in human pursuits and creativity, and so-called left and right political systems alike rather than being opposites? In other words, Dr. Skinner, aren't your control experiments better restricted to the laboratory and used in circuses rather than applied to human societies? And I'd like to have Dr. Mayo, May, also comment on. I'm sorry.
Well, I think you want me to comment first. I quite agree that the techniques of fascist societies and those of the communist societies of which we have examples tend to be alike. They are alike because they appeal to punitive, coercive control. People in those societies behave in order to avoid the consequences of behaving otherwise or of not behaving. The thing that I have emphasized throughout my research in the laboratory and in its application to human behavior in the world at large is an alternative to coercive or punitive control, namely control through positive reinforcement, which is an enormous step forward. It's a step we take very slowly because positive reinforcement is nothing that we can deal with as easily as we can punitive control. If we're bigger than someone else, we beat him up and we've then controlled him. But the use of positive reinforcement, the results are delayed. We've only learned recently how to do this effectively. I would say that the application of these laboratory results to daily life are an enormous step away from the kinds of control exemplified by fascist and communist states.
I think certainly in their totalitarian aspects, which was the first part of your question, communism and fascism are the same, but I don't think at all that we then can say, therefore, they are the same. Totalitarianism begins, or fascism begins, with the identification with the middle class and the economic aspects of the business aspects of the society. Communism begins out of, to my mind, a compassion for workers, identification with the masses. Now, then it becomes totalitarian, but I think there is a distinction that we must not lose sight of. Now, Dr. Skinner mentioned his work in the laboratory, and this is for the point where I have some real questions about the, not about the laboratory work as such, but about the problem that Dr. Skinner and I have discussed several different times, that somebody controls somebody else. It's as though we figure out what's best for everybody else, or best for other people, and we learn the techniques by which we can control them. Now this is where I disagree with Dr. Skinner, and I think that this possibility is anti-democratic. I think it goes beyond the, well, I think there is such a thing as the rights of persons. I'm sure Dr. Skinner would agree with me entirely there, but the problem of the control, out of some knowledge we have of what's best for somebody else, seems to me to be highly dubious. Now, I've given you a good chance to
Well,
enter in there.
I submit that we are always being controlled by the physical world in which we live and by the social environment, our friends, acquaintances, and so on. The small baby learns very quickly to control its parents by crying at the right time. It's something that we do very quickly. What we want to do, I think, is not to remove controls, but to improve them, to make them more effective. And the behavior modifier is not a person who remains in control any more than the teacher does. The teacher has not finished his or her work until he or she can withdraw from the picture. If the student comes back for help from the teacher, the student has not been well taught. The counselor, the guide, has not counseled or guided well if a person must return for further guidance. Instead, the counselor and guide must withdraw from the picture entirely. You get an example of this in, let's say, family counseling. A family is having trouble, and a person who believes in positive reinforcement examines what goes on and finds that everybody's criticizing everybody else, jumping on everybody, and he teaches members of the family how to, if necessary, tape their mouths shut to stop that bickering and quarreling, and then to begin to discover little ways of being nice, of reinforcing the good things that others are doing. And if he is successful, he can then withdraw from the picture. Now, if he's not successful, it won't work. But if he gets out, the family then functions well because the members are controlling each other. And I insist that it is control just as much as the bickering and criticism is bad control. This is better control, and it makes for a happy family. But the behavior modifier has long since got out of the picture. He's not there. He's not running anything. He's not controlling anybody. And I don't for a moment think that we're looking forward to a world in which someone will be in the position of a totalitarian ruler who is going to dictate what people do.
I have a question for Dr. Skinner and May. I've heard Dr. Skinner talk about rather than destroying power, let's correct it. And my question to both doctors is, if in designing a more egalitarian society, what would you suggest to take the place of money, since we know that it is a natural reinforcer and not equally available to all members of the society?
Can I start that? I doubt whether anything will take its place except something like credit or a computerized system sometime which will be used in place of money, because we are not in contact with the people for whom we produce goods. Hence, we are not able to exchange goods in the form of barter, and we have to go through some intervening stage. A large industry is perhaps necessary, and if that is the case, then something like a token is necessary. We are all living in a token economy, of course, a money economy, where money is used to reinforce people for being productive, and it's used to buy the goods they produce. This seems to me to be an essential form of manipulation. Now, the fact that large people can acquire large amounts of money and through it control others in ways which only redound to their own benefits is the kind of thing which needs to be counter-controlled. That's nothing wrong with money itself. It's something wrong with the way in which it's used.
Well, I think it's a very good question in that I do think that money has become a symbol for our work, and this has thrown the whole idea of work off kilter. The money comes in as an artificial criterion. Now, I certainly believe and hope that we will move into a society where money will become less and less important. And I'm very much interested, as Dr. Skinner mentioned, in the fact that credit cards are becoming so used as if you have money to start with, apparently you don't need any money to live, and you live always on credit cards. Fantastic how when I made this trip out east this time, I generally have to take along $300 to make sure I don't get high and dry someplace without a hotel or whatnot. Now I just don't have to, or if I take it along, I don't spend it. I use credit cards. And I've heard it predicted by economists that by the year 2000, practically nobody will use money. Now what we need to correct is the fact that money has been a symbol, and that we must take some care about other symbols coming in there, of the criterion of a person's work, labor, concern, that has nothing whatever to do with the work as such.
Dr. May and Dr. Skinner, Van Leer, we face a torrent of election year rhetoric with reality and absurdity professionally mixed to confuse us. Now, Conrad Lorenz says humor is the best of lie detectors, verbatim. Question 1, should we take heart then from seeing that at least 8 of the behavioral wizards assembling here this week under the American Psychological banner are focusing on wit and humor? And question 2, is there an enormous unused potential in wit and humor, shown by the dazzling 101-year success of Gilbert and Sullivan?
I think if Gilbert and Sullivan were here today, they would have a ball with what's going on in the national election. No doubt about that. A character in a book of mine once said that the chances that your vote will determine a national election are less than the chances that you will be killed on the way to the polls. No one really votes in the expectation that there's going to be a one-vote difference and that his or her vote is it. However, candidates are engaged in cooking up all sorts of other reasons for voting. You knife someone you don't like, or you support someone you do like. You create, these are emotional systems which give you some result, going to the poll and putting an X here and not there. I doubt very much whether that can really be called democracy as such. it's something we have, and we're going to be stuck with it because that's the way things go. But whether that is how this country is run is another matter, and I doubt very much whether that is the case.
Well, I certainly am 100% behind the questioner. I think wit and humor is tremendously important. This reminds me of a story. I will not tell the story, though. But humor is a way of our becoming objective about ourselves. It's a way of the unconscious, if I may use that term, coming into consciousness, and at the point of the breakthrough, we laugh. Now, that breakthrough is very refreshing, as we often put it, and has even more political implications than that. It's a very effective political weapon, and also I think it's one of the interesting things about our nominating conventions every 4 years. They're kind of circuses. And I can look at them with a sense of responsibility, but also I can look at them for the laughs.
Bill Condon from Bethesda, Maryland. I'd like to ask Dr. May a question. He indicated that we are now living in a transitional period. However, it appears that throughout the ages we've been living in a transitional period. Noah had to build an ark in order to get away from the hordes of sinners. Diogenes carried his lantern around trying to find an honest man. The Ottoman Empire almost went to Vienna with all their plundering. And it appears that we're still only about 1 inch from barbarism, with a facade possibly of civilization. Do you think that we still are more or less close to being barbarians, and we're just still doing what's in our self-interest?
Yes. I could stop there, but I feel I really ought to say something a little more than that. Yes, I think it's very important to realize, as Milgram, as I say, in this Eichmann experiment demonstrated, we all could be the Germans, you see. I do think it's important and clarifying for ourselves if we realize that however you make that inch is tremendously important for civilization, obviously, but all of us are relatively close to barbarism. I don't think there's any doubt about that. However, this doesn't really change our problem. This makes it, well, more dynamic and more interesting. Now, I don't agree at all with your saying that all ages, therefore, are the same. That's an anti-intellectual statement, and we simply have to understand how cultures are born, how they develop, and at the points of their sociological health and at the points of their disintegration. And though we never can do that exactly, I think we must do it as best we can.
Ida Long, Annandale. Shirley MacLaine, in her book on her visit to China with an all-woman delegation, says they found the Chinese people so devoted to the common good that the American women were so shocked they became physically ill. They had always believed cynicism and selfishness ruled human behavior, and Shirley no longer wanted to act in sleazy movies. And my question is, in view of the puritanical emphasis of socialist societies, can you understand their desire to protect their people from contamination by our corrupt, laissez-faire civilization? And have either of you ever been in a socialist country and met with the people?
I did not get that question clearly. Would you repeat it, please? Can you summarize it?
Well, I could just say the last part. In view of the puritanical emphasis of socialist societies, can you understand their desire to protect their people from contamination by our more corrupt society?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I don't quite. Will you summarize it, Mr. Chairman? Would you summarize the question?
Well, we always want free exchange of ideas. You know, the Western countries want free exchange with the socialists, but they reject it because they're afraid of contamination by our barbarous mass culture.
Well, you seem to have answered your own question.
I don't get your, I think I could get your point. I'm not getting the signal through. There's something about the echoing here. Your voice is not coming through to me. I'm sorry. Would you state it so that I can hear it, Mr. Zaito? Did you hear it?
Do you see your Walden coming true in the socialist countries? And can you see why they don't want contamination from our Hollywood culture?
Well, let me try to answer it.
Please, yes.
Now, I think the trip of Shirley MacLaine to China was exceedingly interesting, and I don't think you give it quite accurately there, but nevertheless, I found it a very refreshing thing to hear about and to re-experience with her and the women who went along. Now, the socialist countries are able to, at least in China, from what Shirley MacLaine says, they're able to generate a sense of community that we just don't have. And I think it's a sign of our disintegration that we don't have it. I think this sense of community in China is tremendously valuable. But it seems quite unworkable if you have to protect your sense of community from contamination from other countries. And I would regard it, if they do feel they're going to be contaminated by us, I would regard it as a sign of real progress on their part, when they got to the point where they could be strong enough to have the interrelationship without this fear.
I think I can put the pieces together now and get to what the question must have been. I'm very much interested in what is going on in China too. I think that they have encouraged a kind of community, a spirit of community, by working in the small. Schumacher's book on Small is Beautiful, I think, is along these lines. They have managed to get small groups of people to do things by themselves. This is now practiced by industrial management in some other countries of the world. You get a few people in a system where you get personal reinforcement rather than just the gross reinforcement of money systems, and that's good. I still am worried by the fact that there's a great deal of punitive control in China. I have a very close friend whom I've not seen for many years, but he's a scientist living in Peking, and he wrote to me a number of years ago about a book of mine called Walden 2, and he said, "Dear Fred, why worry about a community for 1,000 people? Come to China and see it for 700 million. Well, he believes it. I trust his judgment. He's a very intelligent person, and I think he means that just what he says, that they are building the kind of community which will function as a social environment relatively free of the centralized bureaucracies with which we identified government in this country. But whether they manage it or not, I don't know. I think there's evidence that they are in trouble too. Any large group will be in trouble because it must delegate powers to people who will then misuse them."
Next question.
I'd like both Dr. May and Dr. Skinner to respond. What do you think are some myths that might give us a humanistic future rather than a future of spiritual robots?
The future of what?
Spiritual robots.
Oh.
What myths would give us a humanistic future? She says.
I don't think that way. I don't see how I can really answer it. I am very much concerned about the future and whether or not it is possible for human behavior to take the future into account. I don't believe it's done by myths, and I don't think that I don't think that a useful conception of human behavior is symbolized by a robot, if that's what you are implying. Do you have something to say about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I have done a good deal of work and thinking in the field of myth, and I have a quite different attitude toward it from Professor Skinner. I think a myth is a non-material way of presenting dramatically a given truth that then strikes the human being on all levels at once, unconscious and conscious, group, individual, past and present. A myth is what is shown in a good movie. See, they can jump all around with their camera. In this sense, well, your Walden too is a myth, in my definition. And that's a compliment. I mean, it's a way of constructing something that one believes is significant for human beings and presenting that in dramatic form or novel form or film form or whatnot. Now the question that is asked is, what are the myths of the future that can be of a real benefit? Well, I think that the myth of community, you have to get over the idea that myth means falsehood. I think is a completely distorted view of the meaning of the term. The concept, the form, the dramatic presentation of community is one of the important myths for the future. The myth of women's liberation, I think, is important. It's going to mean the liberation, if it's successful, and I think it will be, liberation of all of us. And the myth of one world, the trip to the moon, I don't think was terribly important practically. Symbolically, it was fantastically important, because it led us to identify with human beings who had to look at the planet as a totality. We no longer could look at it, the United States separate from China and so on and so forth. It had to be seen as a total unit. Now, these myths and others like them that seem to me to be the harbingers of a new society, and I myself believe that they are very important in the forming of the ideas that lead to this new society.
I certainly agree that I agree with your definition of myth entirely. I think it's very important. I don't think that it needs to be associated with historical, literary, musical myths or with current episodes like the moon landing. It is a way in which we find something easily handled to talk about something that's much more difficult to handle, and that is useful. I was just this morning discussing a proverb. The proverb is, "The sharpest knife is most easily nicked." Now, everybody knows that. If you have a knife with a very keen edge, it is likely to get nicked. You can't use it as an axe. That's such a simple thing to understand, but it can mean such a thing as this. A person who is most sensitive to people, to things in the world around him, is most likely to be damaged by those things, most likely to be injured by them. So the most sensitive person is the one who is likely also to suffer. Well, now, it's much harder to say that. It's much harder to put your finger on exactly what is happening in that case. And so you take the proverb, "The sharpest knife is most easily nicked." And that is an easy way to communicate something which would be very hard to put into words otherwise. And I am all for proverbs, I'm all for stories, I'm all for myths, I'm all for religious rituals, so long as they're not taken seriously.
No, you see,
Going to some of the...
let me just say something. You see, what you do there, Dr. Skinner, is to, I feel at least, distort what I was saying. Now, you speak of, you can phrase that exactly. Well, you can put it rationally, but then you leave out a great number of things. A drama presents a truth. An excellent movie, let us say, presents a truth that one cannot present simply rationally, because then it's only the rational mind that's speaking. Now, what I'm speaking about is ways of dealing not only with rationality, but with all of the non-rational functions, with the group function as well as the individual. So you as an individual can only think in your own body. That's what you are, that's what I am. Now, how can we get to somebody else from our own body? It's a very difficult problem. How can we have genuine compassion? How can we have empathy? Now, this is the field in which saying something very concretely doesn't help you, because then you've already said it in your brain. There then comes the need for metaphors, for symbols, for myths, and to my mind, this is a tremendously rich aspect of civilization.
But you can only communicate through words and by describing things which are familiar to the other person. Keats looks into Chapman's Homer. The first time he read a translation of Homer, it's amazing. And how did I feel? How can I tell you how I felt? What he tells you is how you might have felt. If you were an astronomer and a new planet swam into your ken, or if you were Stout Cortez and discovered for the first time the Pacific Ocean, by telling you practical things like that, he can get you to feel in a way that he could not communicate. If he simply said, I read Chapman's Homer and I felt great. He doesn't say anything at all. And a metaphor does this. It is a way of picking on something which is familiar to us all, but it carries a description of something which is much more difficult to speak about. When, in the doll's house, Nora goes out and slams the door, that slamming of the door represented a revolt of women. And it was so easy to put it in those words. It would have been so terribly difficult to write a history of the evolution of women's rights at that particular time. But the slamming of the door is a concrete thing which Ibsen communicates to an enormous audience something about a woman's rejection of a domineering husband. Now, that one little act is a myth, it's a symbol, it's a metaphor, but it does communicate, not by transferring empathically something that you feel to some other person, but by giving the other person something to respond to as you yourself have responded to it.
Going to the written questions, this one addressed to Dr. Skinner. How are positive reinforcement and bribing someone to perform a task different?
Yes, bribery is, of course, something that you do to get someone to do something he shouldn't do. You bribe when there are reasons for not behaving in that particular way. If that is what reinforcement is, then it'd be a very extremely narrow use of the word. And when you make a deal with someone, and if you do this lesson and get the right answer, I'll give you an extra dessert at lunchtime or something like that. That kind of deal doesn't really use positive reinforcement well. It kills the reinforcing effect. That is something like bribery, even though you're not violating the law by solving the problem. I'm against the use of contrived deals of that kind, contracts. It's not a good representation of the strengthening effect of reinforcement. Reinforcement is commonest when other people are not supplying the reinforcers. If you're a painter, you put paint on a canvas and you scrape it off or leave it there, depending upon whether what you see reinforces you. Now, you're not being bribed for painting a picture that way. The process is very different. However, if suddenly I offer you a prize and get you to paint, or otherwise you'd be sitting and doing nothing, you could say I'm bribing you to paint, and that probably would not produce a very good picture. That's because a contract has been set up, but that's not an example of positive reinforcement, pure and simple.
Dr. May, are you aware of any epidemic of depression in this country among persons in their 20s? If so, can we relate it to what happened in the 60s?
Yes, I am aware that there is a great deal of depression in this country, particularly among the youngish people. I think it's related to the rebelliousness of the 60s only as a kind of, well, that didn't work. What should we do now? Now, I don't mean to cast aside the effects of that rebellion. I think in some ways it was genuinely constructive, but it actually, it does not really help anymore. And young people are in the midst of this moorlessness, this lack of standards, this paddling about an ocean in which they have no compass. They are the ones upon whom the change of standards, values, mores falls hardest. And it does not surprise me at all that many of them are very depressed.
Harry Falkoff, Toronto. I read recently of an experiment in California where a class began a program called The Third Way, whose results very much paralleled, at least in principle, a totalitarian state. Recently, there was a television program called The 10th Level, again reportedly based on an actual experiment, which dealt with authority and punishment by means of an electrical shock. I wonder if you might both comment on man's reputed submissiveness to authority in light of Dr. Skinner's opening remark that cultural control, or the lack of it, is responsible for our worsening behavior.
Well, if I'd start that, you've mentioned my name first. I am bitterly opposed to identifying behavior modification with implanted electrodes, psychotropic drugs, the use of shock or vomit conditioning, and so on. These are all extremely aversive, punitive methods. They're not new. People in the Spanish Inquisition knew how to use similar forms of aversive stimuli, and I'm against it. And I do not mean when I say that we have given up on some important social sanctions and therefore are suffering from too much individual freedom, that we should go back and enforce the laws, make them work for what they get, and so on. That's not the answer. There are new ways of bringing about social control. And that will bring us back to some balance between freedom and tyranny without reinstating the punitive practices which we associate with tyrannical or fascist control.
Did you want me to say anything? I don't know. I do feel that Dr. Skinner has a very difficult task ahead of him in distinguishing between the authoritarian tendencies that, at least let us say in the general public, are associated with operant conditioning. Now, there certainly is a tendency among modern people to accept authoritarianism, partly because there's nothing else to accept. You see, always in the time of disintegration, one grabs at whatever one can grab at, and the authoritarian making everything very simple and direct, making everything obvious. This is easy to hang on to. It's easy to give over your own control to somebody else and to do what somebody else tells you to do, like the people in Milgram's experiment did. Now, we are only an inch from barbarism in that point. But nevertheless, there must be a distinction between the authoritarianism that can be accepted so easily, and I think in the long run, if it's accepted that easily, it's very destructive. There must be a distinguishing of that from the genuine searching of people to find moral standards that will be constructive and will build toward a valuable way of living together.
It seems to me that you're still identifying control with coercive, punitive methods, and I would like to quote one half of the title of your book and a phrase from one of mine in which someone says, what is love but positive reinforcement? And the other person replies, or vice versa.
Along these same lines from the cards, Dr. Skinner, could you give a brief behavioral analysis of the death penalty?
Yes. The death penalty is obviously a gesture of panic. It's a revenge. I think on a small scale we have the same problem with corporal punishment in schools. We feel it's necessary because we've got somebody we can't control otherwise, and yet we fail really to control when we use those methods. I'm not saying that the death penalty does not deter a bit of crime here and there. It is in itself a crime. I would much prefer to see society change itself in ways which would not make a renewal of that particular form of punishment necessary. It is quite true that when you punish a person by killing him, he never behaves badly again. But that is not what I would call behavioral control, any more than giving poison as a way of curing a disease. If the patient dies, he doesn't have the disease, but you haven't really cured the disease. I want to see better techniques worked out for the control of those who have not had the kind of control that will induce them to behave well without punitive sanctions.
Next questioner.
I'm a student from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my mother has worked for many years with Dr. Larry Kohlberg. I'm curious how the two of you think human behavior can be improved. Can people be taught higher values without the totalitarian control that everyone is afraid of?
Yes, I think they certainly can be. This is, of course, an omnibus question. All the questions we have discussed so far fit into this one, and therefore it really can't be answered. But I do think that teaching is certainly one of the ways that we share our, quotes, wisdom or our ideas with somebody else, and out of this interchange there can be born a new conception on the part of both the teacher and the pupil. You want to say something?
Well, I don't want to make your mother unhappy in her work with Dr. Kohlberg, but I'm not impressed with the notion of a developmental sense of ethics. I do not think something develops in the individual. Something develops in the environments of people. The sanctions which lead very small children to behave well with respect to others differ from those which take over as the individual grows older. And so that you have not the development of an ethical sense, but the development of an ethical environment. And that, I think, is Kohlberg's mistake.
I'm Herbert. Pardon me. I'm Herbert. I'm Herbert.
He's being heckled.
I'm Herbert Forcage from Arlington, Virginia, and my question is addressed primarily to Professor Skinner. Could you give us some examples of controls that you would like to see established which presently do not exist?
What kinds of control can you bring in place of those we now employ? I can't give you any prescription for taking over the federal government, but you have to begin in small places. And I know that changes are being made in, let us say, schools, which get us away from the old classical and shameful history of education in its use of the birch rod and the paddle and the tawse. The tawse is a leather strap which doesn't leave any marks on the child. Education has functioned this way for thousands of years, and we are coming out of it by finding new ways. Now, the mistake at the moment of the educational philosopher is to suppose that permissiveness is the alternative to punitive control. Nothing could be worse than that. I think the free school is a disaster. But there are ways of giving students positive reasons for studying, applying themselves, making progress. I can demonstrate that. I could take you to school where that's going on. No doubt about that. Now, that's only the beginning, I know. But in the field of counseling, I think, Dr. may disagree with me, but I think a great deal is being done there, which is also in the direction of not holding the individual responsible. That is tied up to punitive sanctions, but to give the individual, give him or her positive reasons for behaving in an outgoing way so that depressions disappear and so on. I would say that a good deal is being done in industrial design to give workers better reasons for working carefully and productively. The ordinary weekly paycheck, everyone knows, is not a satisfactory arrangement. That's not punitive, on the surface, and yet fundamentally it is, because no one works on Monday morning for the paycheck that arrives on Friday afternoon. He works on Monday morning in order not to be fired by a supervisor, so he won't get that check on Friday afternoon. It's a punitive plan, and you can change that to other kinds of control. Now, these are entering wedges from all directions. Someday they will get to Washington, but that's a long way off, I'm afraid.
I think Dr. Skinner's introduction of the reinforcement, that is, the rewarding of good behavior, is one of his great contributions. But I would want to say, Dr. Skinner, that responsibility can be used in many ways not punitive. See, responsibility means to respond to something or other. And I'm thinking of it not at all as punitive. When I have a patient, this patient must take responsibility at least for getting there that day. If he got there on his own, he sat down in the chair. I have to find something in which he is involved, which he did it. And this is the beginning of a sense of responsibility that's going to be developed, hopefully, in all sorts of ways. Now, this is not punitive.
No, I accept that. I accept your emendation. I was thinking of legal responsibility.
Yeah.
Where a man is responsible in the sense that he can be punished. Women also.
Yeah.
We have an interesting question here from the cards. Recent studies by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Dr. Carlos Assis, and others, I may pronounce their names wrong, indicate that there may be, in fact, life after death. I don't know how that's being studied. Should this move out of the realm of conjecture and into the realm of fact, what do you foresee as the result on aspects of human behavior? Will we be better or worse human beings?
You want to take that?
Well, I am afraid that if people do, let us say, become convinced that there is a afterlife for everybody, that this would be a kind of opiate. This is the original phrase came from Marx. Heaven, a religion, meaning a heaven, future, rewards in heaven, rewards in the future, after death. This was an opiate for the people, and I think that has to be taken very seriously. Now, there will be no empirical proofs of this, incidentally. I think they're really off the track at that point. But I think it's necessary, regardless of what happens after death. Nobody knows whether there is any kind of existence or not. And I think it's best not to worry about it. I think it's best to take seriously what one is doing in this particular world. And I believe this involves being able to face extinction, if this is what occurs, but then whatever may be more than extinction or whatnot, whatever there may be, is all gravy.
I'm worried. I'm agreeing with Dr. May altogether too often. But I think it's important to point out that there are many religions involving many hundreds and hundreds of millions of people that do not take an afterlife into account, and they are equally satisfactory, apparently, so far as life on Earth is concerned, and I see no demonstrable improvement as a result of particularly the Christian exclusive avenue to salvation. I think it's been misused for purposes of control oftener than it has been used to make people happier.
I'm told that we've run out of time. I'd like to thank Dr. May and Dr. Skinner for being with us today, and I'd like to announce that the next program will be again next Wednesday at 10:30 here in the Eisenhower Theater of the Kennedy Center, when Francis Fitzgerald, the author of Fire in the Lake, and Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia will discuss American nationalism reconsidered. Leslie Gilb from the New York Times will be the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thus the conclusion of this national town meeting, the topic of which was human behavior, is it getting worse? The principal speakers, once again, were Dr. B.F. Skinner, author and psychologist, and Dr. Rollo May, author and psychologist. The moderator was Tom Zito of the Washington Post. Technical director for this broadcast was John Cater. This is Charlie Cobb speaking. Funds for this program were made possible through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is NPR, National Public Radio.